The answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything is 42.
Life has no meaning. Since the death of God, the collapse of meaning in the world has left a void that needed to be filled. For some, comfort would be found by turning to other ideologies, but for many of us, the collapse will just leave us feeling empty. We now live in the digital age. Every day we are bombarded with an overabundance of information and content. Social media overloads us with constantly more ideas and perspectives. Inevitably, we end up comparing ourselves to all of these other lifestyles, and soon we begin asking ourselves, what is the meaning of our own existence? But with so many possible answers, none of them ever feel satisfying. The sheer excess of information creates an unsolvable paradox. Instead of granting us clarity, it overwhelms. Every belief, every purpose, every lifestyle seems just as valid and just as meaningless as the next. We scroll endlessly, consuming fragmented realities, exposed to infinite versions of what life could be, and in the process, meaning itself begins to feel arbitrary, as if it were just another passing trend. In this digital chaos, nihilism emerges not as a choice, but as an inevitability. If everything is possible, then how can anything truly matter? The tragedy of the 21st century is that we now live in a world in which any of our wildest desires can be met, and yet this is a world that always seems to keep us wanting more. So how do we cope in a world without meaning? How do we solve the inherently paradoxical nature of our existence? Today we'll be tackling how life has no meaning, and why that's okay. From Sartre and Camus to the digital age and the science of motivation itself. That's right, today we're diving headfirst into the question of meaning, only to show you why we might not have needed an answer at all.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. Would you like to talk about the meaning of life?
Hello and welcome to the channel. My name is Thibaut and I make videos on philosophy and science. Following our previous episode on nihilism, today we'll be exploring the philosophies of existentialism and absurdism. Let's start with existentialism. The central claim of existentialist philosophy is that existence precedes essence. But what the heck does that mean? Take a look at this ashtray. The purpose of the ashtray is to hold a smoker's ash. Smokers need ashtrays, and thus ashtrays are manufactured in order to satisfy that demand. In this case, the essence of the ashtray precedes its existence. The ashtray exists because of its purpose. But the same does not hold for us conscious beings. We exist before our purpose. We humans are thrown into life, without a word of say as to who we shall be born as, into what family, and in which time period. There is no underlying reason for us being here, and yet it seems that as conscious beings, the mere fact that we exist demands of us that we search for our lives' meaning. First we exist, and then we must determine why.
What is my purpose?
You pass butter.
Oh my god.
Yeah, welcome to the club, pal.
Unlike the ashtray, humans do not have a built-in purpose. But since we have no predefined essence, then that means that there is nothing dictating what we must become. There is no blueprint, no cosmic instruction manual. We are left to define ourselves, to carve out meaning where none is given. But this is not a gift, it's a burden. Because without an inherent purpose to fall back on, the responsibility for who we are and what we do falls entirely on us. And thus, in the words of Jean-Paul Sartre, man is condemned to be free. Existential angst has probably been around for as long as man has had the ability to reflect upon his condition. Once our most basic survival needs were met, we inevitably began searching for something more, something to give our lives purpose. This progression is reflected in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which suggests that after securing food, safety, and social belonging, we turn our attention to higher questions of meaning and self-actualization. But why is this the case exactly? What is it that drives us to pursue meaning in a world that seemingly offers none? Dopamine is often misunderstood as the happiness hormone, but really it isn't responsible for happiness itself. Instead, what it functions as is the reward anticipation hormone, motivating us to pursue any kind of rewarding behavior. Dopamine is what drives us forward. It's what fuels our desires to go chase after goals. Here's how it works. 1. Anticipation of reward. When we see something that we desire, success, love, knowledge, dopamine levels rise in response to the expectation of pleasure. Let's say, for example, that we are hunting and we come across a gazelle. Our dopamine levels rise in anticipation of how that gazelle's meat might taste, and so our brains quickly try to figure out how to get us from our current state to one in which we might be delighting in that wild, gamey treat. Humans are excellent function approximators. We, perhaps more so than any other being in the universe, have an exceptional capacity to carry ourselves from a given state X to an end state Y. And so our brain devises a plan. 2. Motivation to pursue. The dopamine surge compels us to act, pushing us toward our goals. Chemicals rush through the body as our arm prepares itself to lunge a spear in the direction of the gazelle. Our muscles tighten, our focus sharpens, and for a fleeting moment, the entire world collapses into this singular act. The rustling of the wind, the distant calls of other creatures, all of it fades into irrelevance. There is only the spear, the gazelle, and the space in between them. This is the moment dopamine was driving us toward. The body, now fully primed, commits to the action with intense precision and force. The spear cuts through the air, bridging the gap between anticipation and reality. Success or failure, reward or disappointment, lies only a heartbeat away. 3. Reinforcement and learning. If a reward is better than expected, dopamine reinforces the behavior. If it is worse, dopamine drops, signaling disappointment. After the act, the brain will analyze those particular patterns that led up to this reward, and over time, those neural pathways will be reinforced. But here's the catch. Dopamine is not about satisfaction, it's about seeking. The moment we attain our goal, the dopamine rush fades, and so we start looking for the next best thing. Nowhere is this better illustrated than with doom scrolling. When we scroll through social media, we are hunting for that one piece of content that will get us feeling something new. As soon as we find it, the dopamine fades, and our brain's biochemistry compels us to return to the hunt. This is why people often feel unfulfilled even after achieving their dreams. Because dopamine doesn't allow us to simply be content. It keeps us moving, restless, always chasing the next high. In fact, dopamine doesn't even have to motivate us towards paths that we deem pleasurable. It just drives us towards anything that alleviates stillness. In 2014, a study by Timothy D. Wilson and colleagues found that when people were left alone in a room without anything to do, many participants would choose to give themselves mild electric shocks rather than having to sit in silence alone with their thoughts. This suggests that our brains crave stimulation so much that they will drive us towards any form of engagement, even one that is painful. Existentialism seems to ask of us that we find our life's meaning, but science and wisdom tells us that this remains a futile goal. Even if we do find our life's true calling, achieving that goal will always leave us feeling unfulfilled. As Jim Carrey once said, "I think everybody should get rich and famous and everything they ever dreamed of so they can see that it's not the answer." In a world without inherent meaning, our dopamine-driven nature leaves us in an endless loop. We set goals, chase them, achieve them, and then feel empty, prompting us again to seek something new. This is the hedonic treadmill, the cycle of wanting more, never quite reaching everlasting fulfillment. Our connection to social media feeds us with an endless barrage of data, showing us infinitely many ways that our lives could be lived. We are bombarded with countless images of how our lives could and should be, making our current reality feel perpetually inadequate in contrast. And perhaps this is at the heart of our existential angst. We are wired to seek meaning, but the moment that we grasp it, it slips through our fingers, urging us to pursue something else. No achievement, no success, no amount of wealth or recognition can ever provide the deep, lasting satisfaction that we hope for and expect. So what do we do to alleviate this affliction? Is there a way for us to step outside of this cycle, or must we somehow learn to embrace it? A friend of mine recently gave me my tarot reading for the month of January. Now, as you might imagine, I don't believe in that shit. But then again, I don't believe in much, so I thought, f it, why not? So as I'm being read this card, I'm beginning to realise, wow, this actually does do a fair job at summarising this past month for me. In a way, the reading had assigned significance to my month of January. And I thought, well, this is absurd, you know? I don't for the life of me believe in tarot or astrology, and yet somehow this has attributed some kind of meaning to my life. And that's really all that we're looking for. Meaning. Deep down, the tarot reading doesn't really have to make sense, because when you begin poking at anything for long enough, nothing really does. Albert Camus, the French philosopher and founder of absurdism, would invite us to look at the myth of Sisyphus as a prime example of how we should live in the face of meaning. After angering the gods, the titan known as Sisyphus was condemned to an eternity in the underworld, his punishment involving the rolling of a boulder up an insurmountable hill. Every time he neared the top, the boulder would roll back down, and every day he would have to start his task all over again, rendering his attempts both endless and futile. But much like how I agreed to participate in a task that I didn't believe in, Sisyphus finds himself bound to a task utterly devoid of any meaning. And yet, in both cases, the absurdity of the task doesn't negate the experience. It defines it. According to Camus, Sisyphus's punishment reflects the human struggle for purpose in a world without meaning. Like Sisyphus eternally pursuing an unachievable goal, we maintain the idea of pursuing our life's meaning in a world that offers none. However, what Camus' philosophy suggests is that, by embracing this struggle without hope of resolution, individuals can achieve a form of personal liberation. Absurdism is recognizing the futility in the pursuit of our existence, but going ahead and doing it anyway. In his essay, Camus famously concludes that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, proposing that, by accepting the absurdity of his task, Sisyphus transcends his punishment and takes control of his own fate. In this way, Camus uses Sisyphus to argue for a life lived in defiance of meaninglessness, where the pursuit itself is a form of freedom. We are goal-driven creatures in a world without meaning. For Camus, we can either recognize the absurdity of this fact and continue to embrace the futile pursuit of existence, or we can surrender to some ideology in order to give our lives meaning. The choice is ours. Do we accept the absurdity of our Sisyphean task, or do we take a leap of faith and try and convince ourselves that our lives do in fact have meaning? To use some terminology from our previous video, while existentialism might be seen as a philosophy encouraging us to define the why component of our life's function, absurdism tells us that we should instead focus on appreciating the function itself. Or to quote Stephen Stills, if you can't be with the one you love, love the one you're with. We will never find the ultimate meaning of our lives, because there is none. So perhaps we ought to stop putting so much pressure on ourselves in trying to figure out what is that one thing that we need to be doing with our lives, and instead just go out there and live. The absurd hero is one who lives with his eyes wide open, aware of the lack of meaning yet choosing to live fully and passionately despite it. In the words of the infamous YouTuber Exerbia, absurdism says we can dance in the mystery of life, with the dance being the point all along. Stop debilitating yourself with social media telling you how you ought to live your life. Every person online flaunting their success is just as miserable as any other. This simply is the human condition. We will forever be dissatisfied with anything we achieve. I remember watching a study a long time ago showing that people without children reported greater levels of happiness. But I think that it should be abundantly clear by now that happiness is not what we ought to be striving for. Happiness is forever fleeting. Instead, what we need is fulfillment. Find yourself a rock. Nay, find yourself a boulder. Find yourself the heaviest load that you can carry. The more futile, the better. You can try knitting, cup stacking, or competitive eating. It really doesn't matter. It is not the rock that you choose that will determine your life's meaning, but rather the act of pushing itself. Not because of an outcome, but because of the conscious choice to continue. Embrace the struggle. Embrace the commitment. Be absurd. I hope you enjoyed this essay. This is part of a series of videos on the history of philosophy and the world's major currents of thought. So if you like this sort of content, consider subscribing, and I will see you in the next one. Until then, stay curious.